This is lesson 2 of the Carol Ann Duffy poem, Mrs. Midas. To recap from lesson 1, we started off by looking at the myth of King Midas and compared this to the poem by Carol Ann Duffy, looking at some of the similarities and differences. Today we're going to be looking more closely at the poem to have a bit of an understanding of what is happening to the Midas family. For each part of the poem, we're going to have a look at the vocabulary and see if there are any concepts and ideas that you find difficult to understand. If you're in the classroom, you might want to use this as a chance to discuss with your teacher. If you're working at home independently, you may wish to write down, take some notes of things that you find difficult. On the following slides, you'll then find explanations of vocabulary and ideas in each stanza. It was late September. I'd just poured a glass of wine, begun to unwind while the vegetables cooked. The kitchen filled with the smell of itself, relaxed, its steamy breath gently blanching the windows. So I opened one, then with my fingers wiped the other's glass like a brow. He was standing under the pear tree, snapping a twig. Here you might have come across a new word, blanching. Unless you're a top chef, you might not have known that this was a method of cooking. It means that you boil something for a short period of time and then put it in cold water to halt the cooking process. In stanza 1, you'll notice that Mrs. Midas is in the kitchen cooking dinner. The kitchen is hot and the windows have steamed up. She wipes the window of the condensation, and in the garden she sees her husband at a distance. Stanza 2. Now the garden was long and the visibility poor. The way the dark of the ground seems to drink the light of the sky. But that twig in his hand was gold. And then he plucked a pear from a branch. We grew fondant on, and it sat in his palm like a light bulb, on. I thought to myself, is he putting fairy lights in the tree? You might find the foreign vocabulary here a bit difficult. Fondant d'automne is a type of pear. It's a fancy French name, so it shows that the Midas family see themselves as being quite posh. In this stanza, Mrs. Midas is watching her husband picking a pear. From a distance, it looks as if the pear is like a glowing light bulb. She must think that she's seeing things. Stanza 3. He came into the house. The doorknobs gleamed. He drew the blinds. You know the mind. I thought of the field of the cloth of gold and of Miss Macready. He sat in that chair like a king on a burnished throne. The look on his face was strange, wild, vain. I said, what in the name of God is going on? He started to laugh. There are definitely a few things here that could use explaining. Miss Macready, she's a miss, and that's usually what you might call a teacher in school. So we can assume that Mrs. Midas is thinking back to her school days. She talks here about something called the field of the cloth of gold. This is a historical reference, so Miss Macready must have been her history teacher at school. And the field of the cloth of gold refers to a lesson that Miss Macready gave Mrs. Midas, which was about two kings who, instead of fighting with each other physically, tried to defeat each other by having a battle about who had the biggest fortune. In stanza 3, we see Mrs. Midas being very confused as her husband comes into the house. It looks to her as if all the objects he is touching are turning into gold. And this strange sight reminds her of the history lesson that she had at school. But unlike that old story, surely this can't be real. Stanza 4. I served up the meal, for starters, corn on the cob. Within seconds he was spitting out the teeth of the rich. He toyed with his spoon, then mine, then with the knives, the forks. He asked where was the wine. I poured with shaking hand a fragrant, bone-dry white from Italy, then watched as he picked up the glass, goblet, golden chalice, drank. In stanza 4, there's likely to be a couple of concepts that need explained. The vocabulary of the word toyed means to play with. This shows that Mr. Midas is having fun turning items in his house to gold. You'll also see at the end of the stanza a golden chalice is mentioned. This is a cup that is used in religious ceremonies. There are lots of myths in our society about chalices, and they're very often seen as magical or spiritual objects. In this stanza, Mrs. Midas is serving up dinner. She's giving her husband corn on the cob, but when he tries to eat it, it turns into gold. She knows that something is not right, but she's determined to keep calm and carry on. But when Mr. Midas drinks wine, he turns the glass into a golden cup and starts choking on the wine, which is turned to gold in his mouth. Stanza 5. It was then that I started to scream. He sank to his knees. After we had both calmed down, I finished the wine on my own, hearing him out. I made him sit on the other side of the room and keep his hands to himself. I locked the cat in the cellar. I moved the phone. The toilet, I didn't mind. I couldn't believe my ears. In stanza 5, Mrs. Midas finally accepts that something awful is happening when she sees her husband choking, and you do hear her finally reacting to the situation with fear. However, although she is scared, she still drinks her wine and shows herself to be quite practical, staying away from her husband in case he turns her to gold. Notice that she wants to keep the cat and the phone safe, but is happy to have a gold toilet. A little touch of Duffy being humorous here. Stanza 6. This stanza begins on the previous stanza. It says, I couldn't believe my ears, and then opens here with how he'd had a wish. Look, we all have wishes granted, but who has wishes granted? Him. Do you know about gold? It feeds no one. Aurum, soft, untarnishable, slakes no thirst. He tried to light a cigarette. I gazed entranced as the blue flame played on its luteous stem. At least, I said, you'll be able to give up smoking for good. There's quite a lot of vocabulary here that you'll need to understand. Duffy is using quite a lot of words here that relate to gold. As you can imagine, she could probably use the word gold quite a lot in this poem, but being a poet, she's always going to want to find more interesting ways of saying things. So you have here, for example, the vocabulary of aurum, which is a lovely sounding Latin word for gold. Vocabulary here also of describing the objects as untarnishable relates to gold in that it doesn't fade or stain. We also see vocabulary of the word slakes. This means quenches, to quench your thirst or slake your thirst. Mrs. Midas is saying here that gold will not keep her husband alive, as he will not be able to drink it. Finally, vocabulary of luteous is another word that relates to gold. It's describing a greenish yellow colour. In stanza 6, you can tell that Mrs. Midas is really appalled that her husband has made this crazy wish. She says that all people have wishes, but nobody actually has them come true. She then uses a lot of beautiful words to describe gold as she watches him try to smoke. And then she mocks him by saying that he will be able to quit smoking now. Stanza 7. Separate beds. In fact, I put a chair against my door, near petrified. He was below, turning the spare room into the tomb of Tutankhamun. You see, we were passionate then in those halcyon days, unwrapping each other rapidly like presents, fast food, but now I feared his honeyed embrace, the kiss that would turn my lips to a work of art. There's two pieces of vocabulary that you may wish to know. Tutankhamun refers to a pharaoh whose tomb was discovered to be full of treasures. There's also the word halcyon used, which is generally used as halcyon days, meaning the best days of your life. This is to show the peak of the happiness between Mr. and Mrs. Midas. In this stanza, Mrs. Midas talks about her relationship with her husband. Now she doesn't want him near her, but before this happened, they were a loving couple. She is quite right that if she lets him kiss her now, she will turn to a golden statue. Stanza 8. And who, when it comes to the crunch, can live with a heart of gold? That night I dreamt I bore his child, its perfect o'er limbs, its little tongue like a precious latch, its amber eyes holding their pupils like flies. My dream milk burned in my breasts. I woke to the streaming sun. Two bits of vocabulary here you might find helpful. Ore is a type of rock that contains important metal elements, and a latch is a lock that is a similar shape to a tongue. So both of these things would suggest metal, gold, things that would not belong normally on a baby. The full horror of the situation is shown in this stanza when Mrs. Midas has a nightmare. She dreams of a monstrous baby born to her and Mr. Midas that is more metal and gold than human. It's also very sad at this point, as Mrs. Midas may never now have a child, as well as having lost her husband. Stanza 9. So he had to move out. We'd a caravan in the wilds in a glade of its own. I drove him up under cover of dark. He sat in the back. And then I came home, the woman who married the fool who wished for gold. At first I visited, odd times, parking the car a good way off, then walking. Here in stanza 9, the story's moved on. We can see that Mrs. Midas has taken the decision to abandon her husband. She takes him to their holiday caravan and leaves him there. Let's pause now for a discussion question. Do you think she made the right decision or not? What would you have done in her situation? Please press pause in the presentation and have a little think about it before you move on. Stanza 10. You knew you were getting close. Golden trout on the grass. One day a hare hung from a larch, a beautiful lemon mistake. And then his footprints glistening next to the river's path. He was thin, delirious. Hearing, he said, the music of Pan from the woods. Listen. That was the last straw. A couple of bits of vocabulary here that will be helpful. You might not have heard of a larch before. It's just a type of tree that has goldeny yellow leaves. You might also notice that we have a reference here to the music of Pan. If you remember from our last lesson, this refers back to the original Midas myth, where one of the Greek gods that he met and had dealings with was Pan. It might well suggest that Mr. Midas may meet the gods and have his curse removed, or possibly that he's crossing over into the world of the Greek gods. In this stanza, when Mrs. Midas visits her husband, from her point of view, however, she just thinks he has gone totally mad and decides to cut all contact with him forever. Stanza 11. What gets me now is not the idiocy or greed, but lack of thought for me, pure selfishness. I sold the contents of the house and came down here. I think of him in certain lights, dawn, late afternoon, and once a bowl of apples stopped me dead. I miss most, even now, his hands, his warm hands on my skin, his touch. In stanza 11, we see the end of the poem. However, the story of Mr. Midas has already ended now, as we don't know his fate. Mrs. Midas tells the rest of her story. She has moved house, and we can assume that she's now telling her story to a new friend that she's met. She's probably become quite rich by selling all the things that Mr. Midas turned into gold. However, look back at the end of the poem and think about this question. Do you think she is happy at the end of the poem?